A blood-curdling scream tore through the peaceful morning air, echoing across the tranquil lake. Karen jolted upright inside her tent, her heart pounding like a drum solo. It wasn't the familiar call of a loon. This was raw, primal terror. "What in the—" she mumbled, frantically scrambling for her glasses. The zipper of her tent whined open, and she squinted at the rising sun, her vision blurry without her lenses. Then, a second scream, closer this time, ripped through her fog of sleep. The blood drained from her face. This was no animal. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling. No signal. Of course not. She was in the middle of nowhere, thanks to that infuriating email from the HOA about unauthorized structures, her beloved greenhouse. Peeking cautiously through the tent flap, Karen saw him. Mr. Henderson, the reclusive old widower who lived at the edge of the woods, was sprawled on the ground beside his overturned canoe, his face a mask of pure horror. His eyes, wide with terror, locked onto something behind her. Karen whirled around, her heart in her throat. Two massive, black shapes were bounding towards her, teeth bared, low growls rumbling like distant thunder. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. These weren't the friendly golden retrievers she'd seen frolicking in the distance yesterday. These were beasts. Frozen in place, Karen could only watch in horror as the first dog lunged, its powerful jaws snapping shut inches from her face. A strangled cry escaped Karen's throat as the dog's hot breath washed over her face. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the searing pain of teeth sinking into flesh. But the pain never came. Instead, a deep, gruff voice sliced through the tense air. "Zeus, Hades, back." Karen cracked open an eye to see a figure emerge from the trees. Tall and muscular, with a thick black beard and eyes that blazed with authority, he looked like a lumberjack who had walked straight out of a wilderness survival magazine. His gaze was fixed on the dogs, who now sat obediently, panting, their menacing aura replaced by something akin to canine sheepishness. Relief, swift and overwhelming, flitted Karen's limbs. She was shaking so violently she thought she might be sick. Your dogs," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The man knelt beside Mr. Henderson, checking his pulse. "He's alive," he said gruffly, his eyes never leaving the old man. Zeus just clipped his arm. "But he'll need stitches." He looked up at Karen, his gaze hard. "You're lucky they didn't take a chunk out of you." Shame washed over Karen, hot and prickly. I didn't see them," she mumbled, scrambling back into her tent for some semblance of dignity. "I would never have." "This is private property," the man interrupted, his voice as hard as granite. "You're trespassing." Karen's cheeks burned. She knew she was in the wrong, but the injustice of it all made her bristle. The HOA had forced her to move her greenhouse, her sanctuary, her pride and joy, because it violated community aesthetic guidelines. She had no choice but to set up camp on this forsaken patch of land by the lake, hoping to prove it was a viable alternative location. Now, thanks to this wilderness hermit and his oversized, ill-tempered canines, her plan was in shambles. I didn't realize," she began, but the man cut her off again. "Pack up your things," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You're not safe here." He turned his attention back to Mr. Henderson, who was beginning to stir. As Karen watched him work, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. This wasn't over. She wouldn't let this Grizzly Adams wannabe intimidate her. She had rights, and she wasn't leaving until she got some answers. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Karen retreated further into her tent, her anger bubbling over like a boiling cauldron. Grizzly Adams, as she'd mentally christened him, was tending to Mr. Henderson with surprising tenderness. Her initial fear was quickly replaced by a burning indignation. She was the victim here. The HOA had backed her into a corner, forcing her to this godforsaken place. Emerging from the tent, she decided on a direct approach. Look, she began, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. I understand your dogs got a little carried away, but I have just as much right to be here as... Right? The man's laugh cut her off, a harsh bark devoid of humor. He gently helped Mr. Henderson to his feet, keeping a watchful eye on his dogs. This land belongs to Mr. Henderson, and he doesn't take kindly to trespassers. Karen's jaw dropped. Mr. Henderson. The frail old man who barely spoke English, let alone owned acres of prime lakeside property. This had to be a joke. She glanced around, searching for any sign of a no trespassing sign, but found none. That's impossible, she sputtered, her voice laced with disbelief. He's never said anything. I've been. He's a private man, Grizzly Adams interrupted, his voice cold. He guided Mr. Henderson towards the tree line, the two dogs flanking them like furry bodyguards. He keeps to himself. Karen watched them disappear into the trees, her mind racing. If Mr. Henderson owned this land, her greenhouse relocation plan was dead in the water. The HOA would have a field day. Desperation clawed at her. She had to talk to him, had to make him understand. She hurried after them, ignoring the man's warning growl. Mr. Henderson, please, wait. He paused, turning slowly, his cloudy eyes fixing on her. He said something in a language she didn't understand, the words sharp and guttural. Grizzly Adams stiffened, his hand resting on the collar of one of the dogs. Mr. Henderson, Karen tried again, forcing a conciliatory smile. We need to talk about this land. I'd like to make you an offer. The old man stared at her for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, a slow smile spread across his lips, revealing a single, yellowed tooth. He leaned towards her, his voice a raspy whisper. You want my land? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A chill ran down Karen's spine, despite the warmth of the morning sun. Mr. Henderson's smile did not reach his eyes, which seemed to glint with a strange intensity. She took a step back, suddenly unsure of herself. Well, she stammered, trying to regain her composure. I wouldn't say want exactly. More like, I'm in a difficult situation, and this land would be the perfect solution for my horticultural endeavors. Grizzly Adams snorted. Horticultural endeavors. Karen ignored him, fixing her gaze on Mr. Henderson. I'm willing to offer you a very generous sum, she said, pulling out her trump card. More than anyone else could offer, I'd assure you. Mr. Henderson chuckled, a dry, crackling sound. He spoke again in his native tongue, his voice rising and falling in a melodic rhythm. Grizzly Adams responded, his tone respectful, but with an underlying tension that Karen found unsettling. Finally, Mr. Henderson fell silent, his eyes boring into Karen with an unsettling intensity. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, ornately carved box. With trembling fingers, he opened it, revealing a single withered rose, its petals brown and brittle. He held the box out to Karen, a question in his eyes. This rose, it was my wife's favorite, he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. She planted them everywhere. Red roses for our love. Karen stared at the withered rose, confused. What did this have to do with her offer? Was this some kind of test? She glanced at Grizzly Adams, hoping for a clue, but he remained impassive, his face an unreadable mask. Taking a deep breath, Karen decided to play along. It must have been beautiful, she said, forcing a sympathetic smile. A garden full of red roses. What happened to them? Mr. Henderson closed the box with a snap, his eyes hardening. They died, he whispered, his voice raw with pain. Just like everything else. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the lake, his face contorted with a grief so profound that Karen felt a flicker of sympathy. Then he looked at her again, his eyes burning with an emotion she couldn't quite place. You want my land? He repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Bring me back my roses. Then we will talk. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Karen stared at Mr. Henderson, completely dumbfounded. Bring him back his roses. What kind of cryptic, impossible task was that? Did he expect her to magically resurrect a garden that had been dead for who knows how long? Mr. Henderson, she began, struggling to keep her voice patient. I understand this rose holds sentimental value, but... Sentimental? The old man's voice cracked like a whip, making her jump. He pointed a gnarled finger at the box in his hand, his face a mask of pain. This rose, it represents everything I've lost. My love, my life, my home. He turned away from her, his shoulders slumped with grief. The anger that had simmered within Karen just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a strange mix of pity and apprehension. This wasn't just about a rose or even a garden. This was about loss, about something deeply personal that she couldn't begin to fathom. Grizzly Adams, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice low and soothing, like he was talking to a wounded animal. Come on, Pops, he said gently, placing a hand on the old man's arm. Let's get you inside. It's too much sun for you out here. Mr. Henderson didn't resist as Grizzly Adams guided him back towards the trees. He moved slowly, his head bowed, clutching the box like a lifeline. As they disappeared into the woods, Karen felt a strange pang of guilt, as if she had stumbled into something sacred, something she shouldn't have witnessed. She stood there for a long moment, unsure what to do next. The impossible task Mr. Henderson had set before her echoed in her mind. Asterisk, bring me back my roses, asterisk. Was it even possible? And even if she could somehow manage it, what then? Would he really just hand over his land in exchange for a handful of resurrected flowers? As she turned back towards her tent, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Partially hidden among the trees, barely visible beneath a tangle of weeds and overgrown vines, were the faint outlines of what looked like flower beds. They were old, neglected, long abandoned, but they were there. A spark of hope flickered within Karen. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bring back Mr. Henderson's roses, and with them, her own dreams of a horticultural haven. She had faced down the HOA before. Surely, she could handle a little gardening challenge. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The more Karen stared at the overgrown patch of land, the more convinced she became that this was the key to everything. Mr. Henderson had said his wife planted red roses everywhere. What if, beneath the weeds and neglect, traces of those roses still remained? She grabbed her gardening gloves and a pair of shears from her camping supplies. It wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to at least try. As she pushed through the undergrowth, she could feel thorns tearing at her clothes, but she pressed on, adrenaline fueling her movements. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Thorns snagged on her clothes, and mosquitoes buzzed annoyingly around her head. It was hard work, uncovering years of neglect, but slowly, painstakingly, Karen began to make progress. She unearthed crumbling brick pathways, choked with weeds, hinting at the former structure of the garden. As she cleared away layers of debris, she stumbled upon remnants of trellises, now collapsed and rotten, but once, she imagined, heavy with blooming roses. Then she saw it, a single spindly rose bush, clinging tenaciously to life. Its leaves were sparse and yellowed, its stems gnarled and twisted, but it was undoubtedly a rose bush. And beside it, another and another, all struggling for survival beneath the suffocating grip of weeds. Hope surged through Karen. They were alive. Neglected, forgotten, but alive. She carefully cleared the weeds away from the base of each plant, her fingers tingling with excitement. With proper care, she was sure she could bring these roses back to life. It would take time, patience, and a whole lot of fertilizer, but it was possible. Just as she was congratulating herself on her horticultural prowess, a deep voice startled her. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen jumped, dropping her shears. Grizzly Adams stood at the edge of the clearing, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. He looked bigger, more imposing than she remembered, his presence radiating a silent threat. I was just," Karen stammered, scrambling for an explanation. "I saw the roses, and they're alive. I think I can save them." Grizzly Adams didn't move. He simply stared at her, his eyes like chips of ice. "Those roses, they're off limits," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Karen straightened, squaring her shoulders, her initial fear replaced by a familiar surge of defiance. This Grizzly Adams might be intimidating, but she wouldn't be bullied. Not by him, and certainly not after what she'd been through with the HOA. "Off limits?" she retorted, her voice laced with indignation. "Why? Because you said so." He took a step closer, towering over her. "Because they're his," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "And he doesn't want them touched." Karen crossed her arms over her chest. "He told me to bring him back his roses," she countered. "Don't you think saving these is a good start?" A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise? Uncertainty. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. He glanced towards the cabin, then back at Karen, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice brooking no argument. "And don't touch anything." He turned and disappeared into the trees before Karen could protest. Frustration bubbled inside her. Who was this man to tell her what to do? She was on a mission, a botanical rescue mission, and no amount of gruffness was going to deter her. She waited a few minutes, her impatience growing, before deciding she'd had enough of being ordered around. She would just take a peek inside the cabin, see if Mr. Henderson was awake. Maybe she could appeal to him directly, convince him that she was the only one who could restore his wife's beloved roses to their former glory. As she approached the cabin, she noticed a window partially obscured by overgrown vines. She carefully parted the foliage, peering inside. The interior was dim, lit only by a few rays of sunlight filtering through the dusty glass. She could make out a cluttered workbench, shelves stacked with books, and a worn, leather armchair facing a stone fireplace. And in that chair, she saw him. Mr. Henderson sat slumped in his chair, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He looked peaceful, almost serene. But something about the stillness of his posture, the way his hand clutched the armrest, set Karen's teeth on edge. It was then that she noticed the framed photograph on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was a picture of a woman, her face partially obscured by the shadows, holding a bouquet of vibrant red roses. Karen leaned closer, trying to get a better look, when she noticed something else. Something lying on the floor beside the chair. It was a small, ornately carved box, identical to the one Mr. Henderson carried with him. And it was open. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The open box lay on its side, its velvet lining askew. Empty. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and her hand instinctively flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Where was the rose? Suddenly, the significance of the withered rose struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a memento, a symbol of Mr. Henderson's loss. It was something more, something vital. Her gaze darted back to Mr. Henderson, still and lifeless in the chair. A cold dread crept up her spine, tightening its grip around her chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't just a nap. Panic seized her. She had to get help. She spun around, searching for Grizzly Adams, but he was nowhere to be seen. Her phone was still useless, with no signal in this remote corner of the woods. As she raced back towards her campsite, her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. The withered rose, the open box, Mr. Henderson's strange words, the overwhelming sense of wrongness that permeated the air. Bursting out of the trees, she nearly collided with Grizzly Adams, who stood by her tent, a grim expression on his face. "He's gone, isn't he?" she gasped, her voice trembling. Grizzly Adams nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "He waited for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He wanted you to find him." "But the rose," Karen stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "It's gone. I saw the box." Grizzly Adams knelt and gently picked up a single, withered rose lying on the ground beside her tent. It was the rose from the box, unmistakable with its brittle petals and faded glory. "He knew you were the one," he said, placing the rose in her hand. "The one to bring them back. His roses, his love story. He left it all to you." Karen stared at the rose, her mind reeling. Mr. Henderson was gone, but he had entrusted her with something precious, something he couldn't bear to live without any longer. His legacy. As she looked out over the neglected garden, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she knew what she had to do. She would honor his memory. She would bring back his roses. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, she would finally find her own place of peace. The HOA and their endless list of rules seemed a million miles away. This wasn't about zoning regulations or property lines anymore. This was about something much larger, something that resonated deep within her soul. This was her purpose now. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk.